Hello and welcome back to Module 3 for Information Systems Resource Management. This is all going to focus on strategy. In this case, as you can see by the title, Strategic Uses of Information Technology. One of the debates that rages in the industry is whether or not IT is really strategic by itself. And you get into the whole concept of what is a strategy, what is a tactic. Is information systems really just a tool? Can IT really be strategic? And it's going to be one of the questions that we're going to explore in this today. But first, let's take a look at what has been going on. So obviously, the internet itself in the late 90s and 2000s set off an explosion use of IT. People in various companies would say we need to have a website, even though they had no idea why they would need it. But they would say, let's just build it and people will come. That led to, obviously, the dot-com crash. Today, we're seeing the same thing with social media, apps, mobile technologies. You're seeing people say, we need to be in that space. Is that really a strategic thing? Or is it just saying we need the technology for the sake of having technology? So the questions that we're actually left with, even from the internet, and you can just lump them all together, has that revolution really ended? Or is it just the beginning of something that's larger? Or is it completely separate? Does IT itself still matter? Does the technology by itself still matter? Or can we just have the individual business units handle this? What sorts of strategic uses are companies making with their IT decisions? Do they consider it as part of their strategy? And this is where the play between the business users and IT comes into focus. Sometimes techies believe that it is strategic if we move toward a Linux-based system, or if using a mainframe might be a strategic move, when in reality those are really tactics. And again, we really need to understand what strategy is. So the strategic role of IT, your book puts it this way, that there are basically three categories: working inward, improving a firm's internal processes; working outward, improving the firm's products and relationships with customers; and working across, that's between business partners and creating relationships. You'd get some strategists that might have a problem with that, because they'd say working inward isn't necessarily a real strategy. But in some cases it is. If you consider the whole concept of logistics, say within a military, that would be an inward thing to support outward. And so therefore they would consider it strategic. So your book uses this diagram to basically show that working inward is this circular thing of business to employee, making the employees more efficient, making them better to produce better products. Working outward is focused on the customer, and working across would be how we have the interrelationships between, say, our supply chain or the financial chain for electronic funds transactions, or any other business partners that we might have. So was IT ever strategic? Well, the first phase of this, in your book, talks about the various editions. Mid-80s, we help employees learn about PCs. Not really sure that is really strategic, but they make the argument that this was working inward to make things better. But it's really just a tool. These would be a tool such as the deployment of, say, a rifle to an infantryman. Is the rifle itself strategic? Well, you'd get a hard-pressed argument, even though certain rifles have been shown to actually change the course of a military conflict. In the second edition, they focused in the late 80s on use of outward strategies or outward tactics to gain competitive advantage. They started to realize that leveraging IT investments could actually benefit the corporation against their competitors. As we get into the 90s, things basically change. We start seeing re-engineering of business process, because we can do things with the technology a little bit differently. The intent was not to automate existing process, but to redesign how the enterprise operated. Now, you might get a very strong case that that in itself is strategic, because we're restructuring the entire way the business is going to run. Many failed as they were really just layoff plans. What happened in a lot of these cases was we had executives basically putting in these technologies with the whole purpose of laying off a large amount of staff. And that really doesn't bode well for the implementation. People will sabotage it, they won't participate, and as I mentioned in one of the previous modules, if you don't have that participation with business users, you're going to have a failure. Introduction of ERP systems come into play for the bigger firms, not smaller firms, because these were still too expensive at the time, aimed at creating internal efficiencies better. So you see companies like FedEx, UPS, the large banks implement ERP systems in order to effect those efficiencies. But the internet was a really big event, because now we could have this communication across business partners reach our consumers. And the dot-coms used it as a way to gain a competitive advantage. More established firms basically used it to better their processes and increase the communication with customers and business partners by enhancing the overall workflows. So we see now in the late 90s, as this fifth edition of this book was published, you have the dot-com bubble bursting. We had no longer could we say just build it and people would come. You had to have a business model, and that meant that IT and the technology had to be integrated with the business. The integration was the key thing. Were we going to make money, and how were we going to make money? Many of those companies that went belly up in 2000 or thereabouts basically were selling products at far below what they actually cost. They had a negative return. And so just because they believed as long as they could build a website and people would come and they had customers, that was going to be the end all be all and they would be successful. So traditional economics continues to hold. You cannot survive in that type of environment. So the sixth edition comes out early 2000s, where dot-coms are now being innovative. They're looking at how they're using the technology to beat their competition. And this whole notion of striking back is what we see in the early part of the 2000s. We will also know that as the seventh edition comes in, that something's changed. Is that overall we're using technology different. Now, in 2005 through 2010 through 2012, we start seeing the use of social media as a way to strike at your customers, or as a way to defend against customers who want to badmouth your company. You can actually engage them in the social media space. You can put into their hands more information that would prevent them from going to a competitor. So some question IT's ability to give companies a competitive advantage, but it's absolutely necessary, at least for competitive parity. And so you see sometimes people refer to IT. It may not give you a competitive advantage, but at the very least, if your competitors are doing it, then you really want to make sure that you're doing the same thing. And so one of the things that I always talk about when I talk about competitive advantage is not just does it give you a competitive advantage, but is it a sustainable competitive advantage? IT changes so rapidly, and if I build something like a mobile app, I will guarantee you that within a few weeks, my competitor will probably have a similar, if not the same, mobile app. So I'm not going to really realize any benefits from that competitive advantage. So it's really important for technologists to focus on how do I maintain and sustain that competitive advantage inward, outward, and across the enterprise.